Okay, so Moses' time period then becomes 1526 to 1446 BC when the Exodus happens. He lives another 40 years after that. 1406 BC dies, and then after that the Israelites actually go into the land. So that'd be around and they spend some time conquering the land. So that would happen around 1400 BC when they actually went into the land. So why is this important? Why am I talking about this? Why am I wasting a video talking about this? Okay, so the reason why I'm doing that is because now that we have established this, and we have established a chronology based on the chronology of the Hebrew kings via the work done by Edwin Thiele, and we have synchronized that with the dates of the Assyrian kings, which they had extensive contact with during that time, because that's when Assyria was a major power. And Assyria dated some of its events by eclipses and other solar events, as astronomical events that we can calculate with our own software, our own mathematical brain power, to be on certain dates. So by calculating the certain dates of these Assyrian events and then matching up Assyrian history with Israelite history, we can then date Israelite history down through the king list back to Solomon, David, and Saul. And then by calculating Solomon's inauguration year of 930 BC, we go 4 years after that to his 4th year, which is then described as being the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. So then we can have a date for the Exodus. So that puts the Exodus in the mid-1400s BC. So that is the time period in which we should be looking for the Israelites to be leaving Egypt. Obviously, they would have been in Egypt for the centuries before that. This is important because then that gives us a window into which we should be looking for the Israelites to be in Egypt. The problem then becomes if we then have misconstrued or miscalculated our study of Egyptian history and have got the dates for the Egyptian kings wrong. And again, everything is relative. We can have a few fixed dates based on syncing up well-known historical events with astronomical events that we can date precisely to our calendar. But other than that, this is all relative. Even with the mysterious numbers of the Hebrew. By the way, the book that covers this, the chronology of the Hebrew kings, is called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, and it's by Edwin Thiele. He, I believe the most recent edition of his book was published in 1983, and it was a result of a lifetime, an entire adult lifetime, where he had been, I think he first published papers of this in various journals like in the 30s, maybe in the 40s. So he had been working on this puzzle of the Hebrew kings for 40, 50 years, and he had printed 3 separate editions of his book. And the third one was the last one, as far as I'm aware. I think he died not long after that. There were a few issues I think have been worked out by other chronologists since then. But in general, when you look up, say, Solomon, you'll see his years given, or his years as king given from 970 to 930 BC, and we have the work of Edwin Thiele to thank for that. Which is a big deal because again we had forgotten how to interpret those passages since the 2nd century BC. So for over 2,000 years mankind did not know how to interpret the numbers of the Hebrew kings because again they weren't fixed to an absolute timeline like we like to have, like we have today with our way of counting time. They were fixed to each other. The Hebrew kings, even in Kings and Chronicles, those numbers are fixed to each other. They're not fixed to anything else. There's no backbone or spine that these things are being stuck to. Nowadays, when you see charts, you see nice, straight lines, timelines, and certain years marked on those charts, and then you'll see events, lines that point off, and then events described, saying here's what happened here or then or that, whatever. That's how we like to do timelines, and that's not how the ancients did that sort of thing. And even in the Bible, that's not how they did that sort of thing. The Hebrew kings, the chronology of the Hebrew kings is not given in terms of an absolute timeline. It's given in terms relative to each other. So if you're not living during that time period, or if you're living several hundred years later or several thousand years later, and you don't know the clues that these writers are using to interpret their numbering system, it's going to be nonsense to you. And it was for a very, very, very long time. Thankfully, it is not any longer today. We have cracked the code, so to speak. And so we today have the knowledge, have the benefit of the knowledge of dating the kings of Israel precisely. But humankind didn't have that for many, 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 many years, centuries, millennia. Sometime between the fall of the fall of the southern kingdom, Judah, when they fell to Babylon in 586 BC, sometime after that, in between then and the writing of the Septuagint, which was in the 200s BC, sometime in that 300-year time span, the knowledge of the numbers of the kings were simply lost, and it wasn't recovered for 2,200 years. Anyway, so that's just an example of how difficult this is. And of course, when you have Egyptian history, it's the same thing. Egyptian history goes back even farther. Okay, Egyptian history goes back to 2500 plus BC. It's hard to say even really when. In Greek, the name of the pharaoh that we have assigned to be the first pharaoh of Egypt is a guy named Menes. That's his Greek name. I'm not sure if this, in the Bible is called Mizraim. Mizraim is referred to, Egypt itself is referred to as Mizraim in the Bible. If you look at the genealogy in Genesis 10, Mizraim is one of the sons of Ham. It's possible that Mizraim himself was Menes, the first pharaoh of Egypt. Or at the very least, his people apparently went down into that region and settled in Egypt and became the basis of the Egyptian culture. And that would have been just a generation or two after the flood. So we're talking a long time ago. Even in secular history, we're talking many, many, many years ago. And so with the Egyptian king list, we have all the same problems that we have with the Israelite king list, plus the fact that they go back even farther in time. I mean, the Israelite king list, the monarchy only goes back to about 1000 BC. And Saul and David Saul was first king, and he was in the 1000s BC. David was king right around 1000 BC. Egypt, you go back 1,000, 1,500 years, possibly even back before that. By 1000 BC, Egypt was already well underway in its history. Even by the time the Israelites left Egypt in 1446 BC, Egypt's culture was already well established and advanced and mature in years. So with Egypt, you have all the same problems you have with the relative naming systems of the other kingdoms. In addition to the problem that they go back even farther in time, they have an even longer history. And then you have the issue of different kings and dynasties overriding their own history and making things even more muddled by claiming some of their predecessors' achievements for themselves or trying to erase their predecessors or things like that. Egypt left a lot of materials behind, but unlike the Israelites, they didn't leave like a single long document. The Israelites were fond of these long scrolls, apparently. Other nations around them tended not to be, and they would inscribe their history on monuments and statues and stelae, these big stone slabs and things like that. It doesn't seem as though God wanted the Israelites to record their history that way. At the very least, they don't seem to have done that. And so their history then becomes inscribed on these scrolls, which get handed down and copied over and over again for years and years and years. Okay, so about the Egyptian kings. So the timeline of the ancient cultures was dated around the kings. We can date the kings according to our universal timeline based on fixing certain events to certain astronomical dates and then fixing the reigns of the kings around those fixed dates to form a timeline or a chronology. And this is the backbone or the spine of our study of history. But again, if you don't have a fixed event to assign a king to or an important event to and say, okay, this happened in conjunction with this fixed astronomical event during the reign of this king, then the chronologies start floating around and they're very relative and it's hard to determine where they go. And this is the central problem for dating systems And it is particularly true when it comes to Egyptian dating systems because there are so many uncertainties in terms of when these kings actually lived and reigned. First of all, our entire king list itself is on somewhat shaky ground. You look at the list of kings of Egypt, and you can find them pretty easily, and they look a lot more certain than they actually are. You know, we only have really a couple of sources that give us the information for all these lists of kings. And even then, it's incomplete and somewhat questionable in its historicity. One of the main sources is called the King the King List, or the Royal Turin Canon, or the King List. And it's basically what it says. It's a king list dating up to a certain point in time, with a list of kings and the length of their reigns down to the day, you know, years, months, day. And that sounds impressive until you actually look at a photograph of this king list and realize that it's literally in scraps. Okay, they've compiled the entire thing. They, meaning the professionals, have compiled the entire thing basically using only scraps. It would be like taking a roll of toilet paper, unwinding it. A lot of it has faded away or disappeared. You only have small chunks of it left, and then you're trying to like put the remaining chunks together like a jigsaw puzzle piece, like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and trying to figure out, okay, here's how it used to read from start to finish, you know, earliest to latest in terms of the reigns of the kings. And that's in fragments. I mean, it's in tatters. It's just scraps of pieces of paper. And that is one of our primary sources of the list of kings. The other one comes from the history of Egypt as written by a guy named Manetho, who lived in the 200s BC. Now, in the 200s BC, Egypt was no longer an independent nation. It had been conquered many times over by then. It had not been an independent nation for some time at that point. But it was, in the 200s BC, under the control of one of the splinters of the Greek Empire, the Ptolemies. And that's actually the culture that ended up producing Cleopatra, you know, the story of Cleopatra and Caesar and all that. That would be, of course, right before Jesus, the time of Jesus Christ. But this is before that. This is in the 200s BC, during a time when the Ptolemies are ruling Egypt as an arm of the Grecian Empire, which splintered after the death of Alexander the Great. And during this time, an Egyptian priest writes a history of Egypt reportedly for the Greek ruler of Egypt at that time. The problem, and this guy's name was Manetho. This priest's name was Manetho. The problem is that we don't actually have Manetho, assuming Manetho was real, and assuming he actually did write this document, this history of Egypt, for the Greek king of Egypt, or for whatever reason. The problem is that we don't have it. We don't have his document any longer. All we have are excerpts that were recorded in the writings of other ancient writers. Josephus being one of them. Josephus was a Jewish writer in the 1st century AD, in the decades, I should say, after the church was formed. He was present during the war between the Jews and Rome, and from 66 to 73 AD. He was there in 70 AD when the temple fell, when the city was sacked and the temple fell. He was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. He actually had fought in the war on behalf of the Jews. At the beginning of the war, was captured by the Romans, kept as a prisoner, eventually earned the favor of the general in charge of the battle, a guy named Vespasian, when he predicted that Vespasian would become emperor, which he did end up becoming emperor. And so Josephus was then released from captivity and then turned into a Roman. Not really a soldier, but he was meant to be a translator between the Romans and the Jews who were walled up in the city of Jerusalem. After the war was over, of course, he would have been a turncoat and a traitor to the Jews, so he couldn't go back there. So he spent the rest of his days living in Rome under the patronage of Vespasian and his family. Vespasian ended up having a dynasty that went down to his son Domitian, around the time, who died around the same time Josephus died, around the turn of the 1st century, about 100 AD. So Josephus lived in the 100 AD, during the time of the fall of the Jewish temple and sacrificial system, and wrote a whole bunch of stuff about that and about the war between the Romans and the Jews. Very fascinating material. We'll get to that eventually, way down the road. But he also wrote some other treatises or some other polemics against some of his critics, and he quoted this Manetho person and quoted some of and gave us some excerpts of his Manetho's work about the history of Egypt in relation to how long Egypt had been around and all that stuff. And it's through and other writers also quoted and excerpted Manetho's document about the kings of Egypt, or the king list of Egypt, or the history of Egypt. But again, unfortunately, Manetho's own work does not survive. So we don't actually know what Manetho wrote. We simply know what other writers claimed Manetho wrote. But still, and so that's still itself, pretty hypothetical, pretty fragmentary. Okay, it's like it's not a direct source from Manetho. It's an indirect source from other writers centuries later quoting Manetho. Or Manetho, I don't know how you pronounce it. By the way, when people speak these names of these ancient Egyptians today, typically they're speaking of a Greek version of their name. I mentioned a moment ago how the Greeks eventually conquered Egypt. And so a lot of the names, the Egyptian names that have come down to us today, have been filtered through their Grecian forms. I mentioned Menes earlier as the legendary first pharaoh of Egypt. That's a Greek version of the name. Most of the names of the Egyptians that you're going to hear mentioned today or said out loud today are going to be Greek forms of their names. The actual Egyptian pronunciations of these names, as far as I can tell, has long been lost. I don't think you can remember, these ancient languages didn't have vowels, at least not in their early forms, and so the pronunciation of a lot of these words is very, 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 very uncertain. And we typically rely on a Greek pronunciation of these Greek translated versions of these names today.